Imagine you're standing in Iceland in the
This
year
tiny
950 AD.
mound
It's
is
January.
actually a
The
Viking
sun hasn't risen
house
above the
that
horizon
could
for
keep
weeks and won't for
families
weeks more.
alive through
The temperature is minus
deadliest
28 degrees
winters.
Celsius and dropping. Wind is screaming across the barren landscape at 90 kilometers per hour, driving the wind chill to minus 55 degrees Celsius. Cold that will freeze exposed flesh solid in under 2 minutes. The ocean is starting to freeze at the edges. The ground is frozen to depths of 2 meters. Snow is accumulating in drifts that will bury anything that isn't protected. You're not visiting for a weekend adventure. You're not on some historical reenactment that ends when you get cold. This is your permanent home. The place where you were born, where your children will grow up, where your family will live for the next 300 years. And you're about to spend the next 4 months sealed inside a structure that from the outside looks like nothing more than a grass-covered mound of earth barely distinguishable from the landscape around it. No modern insulation. No central heating system. No backup generator or emergency services. No way to leave because the mountain passes are blocked with snow and the sea is too violent for ships. You have what your ancestors developed over centuries of trial and error: a turf house, a building made from earth, grass, stone, and wood that looks primitive to modern eyes but that contains engineering principles so sophisticated that modern architects are only now beginning to fully understand them. Here's what seems impossible. This grass-covered mound will keep you warmer through a Nordic winter than many modern houses with all their technology. It will maintain interior temperatures 40 to 50 degrees warmer than outside using a fraction of the fuel a modern home requires. It will shelter 3 generations of your family through the harshest conditions in medieval Europe, and it will do this so effectively that Iceland, one of the most hostile environments humans have ever permanently settled, will develop a thriving population that survives for centuries using nothing but these turf structures. How did Vikings build houses from dirt and grass that outperformed stone castles and wooden halls in the worst winter conditions? How did structures that look like burial mounds actually provide better thermal protection than buildings that took years to construct with expensive materials? The answer reveals engineering knowledge that was accurate without modern physics, construction techniques that address problems modern builders often get wrong, and survival wisdom that represents one of humanity's most impressive adaptations to extreme cold. Before we reveal exactly how Vikings built turf houses to survive minus 30 degrees Celsius Nordic winters and why this ancient technology worked better than alternatives that seemed more sophisticated, drop a comment with where you're watching from. And if stories of survival engineering that actually worked fascinate you, hit that subscribe button because what you're about to learn will change how you think about shelter, insulation, and what technology really means. The Nordic environment where Vikings built these turf houses presented winter challenges that compounded into conditions at the edge of human survivability. The temperature in Iceland, Norway, Greenland, and the Faroe Islands regularly dropped to minus 20 degrees Celsius to minus 30 degrees Celsius during winter months, with some locations experiencing even colder extremes during particularly harsh years. The wind was perhaps more dangerous than the cold itself. North Atlantic storms hit the exposed coastlines and valleys with sustained winds of 70 to 100 kilometers per hour, with gusts reaching 130 to 150 kilometers per hour during the worst weather events. Wind at these temperatures isn't just uncomfortable, it's a lethal heat-stripping force that can kill an exposed person in under an hour even if they're wearing heavy clothing. The darkness lasted months in the far north. Above the Arctic Circle where some Norse settlements existed, winter brought continuous darkness for periods measured in weeks. Even in southern Iceland, winter days were brutally short, perhaps 4 to 5 hours of dim light surrounded by 19 to 20 hours of darkness. This continuous darkness meant no solar heating, no passive warmth, no psychological relief from the crushing weight of winter. The maritime environment created additional challenges that inland cold doesn't produce. The humidity from the ocean meant that cold penetrated clothing and structures more effectively than dry inland cold. The combination of cold, wind, and moisture created conditions that modern hypothermia research shows are among the most dangerous for human survival. More dangerous than colder but drier continental climates. The resource constraints made everything harder. Wood was scarce or non-existent in Iceland and Greenland. The few trees that existed were stunted by the harsh climate and inadequate for building timber frame structures of any size. Stone was available but difficult to quarry and shape with Viking-era tools. The landscape offered limited building materials, which meant Vikings had to work with what was most abundant: earth and the grass that grew on it. The turf house that Vikings developed to address all these constraints simultaneously wasn't a simple primitive shelter. It was sophisticated thermal engineering that took advantage of materials that modern builders typically ignore or actively avoid using. The construction started with site selection, and this decision was as critical as the building itself. Vikings chose locations with specific characteristics that provided natural advantages for winter survival. A south-facing slope was ideal. It captured maximum sunlight during the brief winter days while providing natural drainage that prevented water accumulation that would undermine the structure. Wind protection was essential. Sites were selected in the lee of hills or ridges that blocked the prevailing north and northwest winds. Even a modest natural windbreak could reduce wind velocity by 40 to 50%, dramatically decreasing the heating load the structure would face through winter. Proximity to water was necessary for daily living, but not so close that flooding or moisture infiltration would damage the structure. Vikings understood that building too near streams or wetlands meant structural problems and increased cold transmission through damp earth. The excavation began by digging into the slope or down from level ground, creating a foundation that was partially below grade. This wasn't just about structural stability, it was calculated thermal engineering. At depths of even 50 to 100 centimeters below the surface, Earth temperature stabilizes at levels significantly warmer than winter air temperature. When surface air is minus 25 degrees Celsius, Earth at 1 meter depth might be minus 5 degrees Celsius to 0 degrees Celsius. That 20 to 25 degree differential means the foundation walls are starting from a baseline that's dramatically warmer than the exterior air, reducing the temperature gradient the structure has to bridge between interior and exterior. The foundation walls were built from stone or turf blocks, creating a base perhaps 50 to 80 centimeters thick. Stone was preferred where it was available because it provided better structural support and better drainage, but many turf houses used turf blocks from foundation to roof, creating entirely earth-based structures. The turf blocks themselves were the primary building material, and understanding how they were cut and used reveals the sophistication of Viking building knowledge. Turf cutting was done in late summer when the grass roots had fully developed but before autumn rains made the ground too wet. The turf was cut in rectangular blocks typically 50 centimeters long, 30 centimeters wide, and 10 to 15 centimeters thick. The critical element was that these blocks included the living grass layer, the root mat, and enough soil to keep the roots alive. This wasn't just chunks of dirt, these were living building blocks that would continue growing and binding together after being placed in the wall. The turf blocks were stacked in running bond pattern like modern bricks, creating walls that were typically 1 to 2 meters thick at the base, sometimes even thicker in the harshest climates. This massive thickness wasn't excess or primitive building practice. It was calculated insulation. Earth and grass have thermal properties that make them excellent insulators when used in sufficient thickness. The R value, thermal resistance, of densely packed earth with living grass is approximately R1 per inch. A turf wall 1.5 meters, 60 inches, thick provides R60 insulation, better than most modern wall assemblies and achieved using only materials literally cut from the ground. The living grass roots continued growing after the blocks were placed, binding the wall into a unified mass. The grass on the exterior surface continued growing, creating a self-renewing weather barrier that shed water while providing additional insulation. A well-built turf wall became stronger and more weather-resistant over the first few years as the grass established itself and the blocks compacted together. The walls weren't purely vertical. They were typically battered, angled inward as they rose, creating a structure wider at the base than at the roof line. This batter served multiple purposes. It improved structural stability, it shed water more effectively, and it created a wall profile that deflected wind upward rather than allowing it to attack the wall surface directly. The interior face of the turf walls was sometimes lined with wood planks where timber was available, creating a smooth interior surface and adding a layer of air space between the living quarters and the cold turf. Where wood was too scarce, the interior turf surface was left exposed but often covered with woven hangings or animal hides that created an air gap providing additional insulation. The roof construction was where Viking builders' understanding of thermal physics really showed. The roof couldn't be just turf piled on top. It needed a structure that could support enormous weight while providing weatherproofing and insulation that prevented the constant heat loss that occurs through any building's highest point. The roof frame started with a ridge beam supported by vertical posts that ran down the center of the structure. From this ridge beam, rafters descended to the tops of the side walls, creating the basic structural skeleton. The rafters were often curved or bent to create an arch that provided better load distribution than straight members. Over the rafters went a layer of birch bark or, where available, wooden planks. This created a waterproof membrane that prevented moisture from the turf layers above from penetrating into the living space below. Getting this waterproofing right was critical because wet insulation loses most of its thermal resistance. Over the waterproof layer went the turf. Not just one layer, but multiple courses of turf blocks, creating roof thickness that could reach 60 to 80 centimeters or even more in the coldest climates. This created an insulated roof assembly with thermal resistance approaching R50 to R60, again better than most modern construction. The weight was enormous. A turf roof could weigh 200 to 400 kilograms per square meter when saturated with water. The entire roof assembly on a house 15 meters long and 5 meters wide could weigh 15 to 30 tons. This massive weight required substantial structural support, but it also served thermal purposes. The weight compressed the turf layers together, eliminating air gaps where heat could escape through convection. The thermal mass of tons of earth absorbed heat during any warm period and released it slowly during cold periods, buffering interior temperature against rapid exterior fluctuations. The living grass on the roof surface continued growing, creating a self-maintaining weather barrier. The roots bound the turf together and prevented erosion. Rain and melting snow were absorbed into the turf layers and either evaporated or drained through the roof structure, preventing the pooling and infiltration that would damage other roof types. The entry to a Viking turf house was engineered with as much care as the walls and roof because it represented the greatest thermal vulnerability, the point where warm interior air could escape and cold exterior air could infiltrate. Vikings addressed this through a design that modern architects call an airlock but that Vikings understood intuitively through experience. The entrance wasn't a simple door opening directly into the living space. It was a passage typically 2 to 3 meters long, that created a buffer zone between exterior and interior. This passage had a door or heavy curtain at the exterior end and another at the interior end, ensuring that both were never open simultaneously during winter. When someone entered from outside, they opened the exterior door, stepped into the passage, closed the exterior door behind them, then opened the interior door and entered the living space. This meant cold exterior air never had direct access to the warm interior. The passage itself became a transitional zone where temperature was intermediate between the lethal exterior and the warm interior. The passage floor was typically lower than the main living space, creating a cold trap where the densest, coldest air settled rather than flowing into the inhabited area. Warm air from the living space, being less dense, floated above this cold air pool and didn't escape easily even when the interior door was opened. The doors themselves were massive, thick wood planks when timber was available, or heavy frames covered with multiple layers of hide when wood was too scarce. The goal was creating a seal that blocked air infiltration while being robust enough to withstand being opened and closed hundreds of times through a winter. Inside the turf house, the heating system had to maintain survivable temperatures using fuel sources that were desperately scarce in the treeless Norse colonies. The central heating element was the langeld, a long hearth that ran down the center of the main hall, typically 3 to 6 meters long and perhaps 50 centimeters wide. The langeld wasn't an open fire pit like earlier Iron Age structures used. It was a carefully designed combustion system optimized for the limited fuel available. The hearth was built on a foundation of flat stones that absorbed heat from the fire and radiated it for hours after the flames died. Around this stone foundation, additional stones created a low wall that contained the fire and provided seating areas. The fuel burned in the langeld reveals the resource crisis Vikings faced. In Iceland and Greenland, there was virtually no wood suitable for burning in quantity. Driftwood collected from beaches was too precious to burn except for cooking. The primary fuel was dried animal dung, peat cut from bogs where it existed, dried seaweed, and twisted bundles of dried grass. These fuels burned differently than wood. Dung and peat provided slow, smoldering heat rather than bright flames. They produced substantial smoke that had to be managed carefully to prevent the interior from becoming unbreathable. But they were abundant where wood wasn't, and they provided enough heat to keep the interior above freezing when combined with the massive insulation of the turf walls. The smoke management was critical because a poorly ventilated turf house could kill its occupants through carbon monoxide poisoning as efficiently as the exterior cold could kill through hypothermia. Vikings engineered ventilation systems that allowed smoke to escape while minimizing heat loss, a delicate balance that required understanding airflow patterns. In the earliest turf houses, smoke simply rose to the roof peak and escaped through gaps in the turf or through a dedicated smoke hole. But this was inefficient because it vented enormous amounts of heat. Later designs added what amounted to a chimney effect using the building's geometry. The roof peak had a controlled opening, not a large hole but a carefully sized vent that could be partially closed with boards or turf blocks adjusted from inside. The langle's positioning created natural draft where smoke rose toward this opening. Fresh air entered at floor level through small gaps deliberately left in the foundation walls or around the door passage. This created a convection cycle where cold air flowed in low, was heated by the langled, rose with the smoke and exited at the roof peak. The cycle was self-regulating to some degree. A hotter fire created stronger draft that pulled in more oxygen-rich air, while a cooler fire slowed the cycle. But it required constant attention from the household to maintain the balance between adequate heating and safe air quality. The interior layout of the turf house was organized to maximize thermal efficiency and ensure that the warmth from the langled reached everyone who needed it. The main hall where the langled was located formed the heart of the house. This was typically a single long room, perhaps 12 to 18 meters long and 4 to 5 meters wide, where most of the family's activities occurred. Along the two long walls were raised platforms called setter, built-up benches that served as seating during the day and sleeping platforms at night. These platforms were typically 50 to 60 centimeters high, elevating sleepers above the coldest air that settled at floor level. Even this modest elevation meant sleeping in air 3 to 5 degrees warmer than floor temperature. The platforms were built from stone, turf, or wood depending on available materials, then covered with layers of insulation. First came old turf or packed grass creating an air-trapping base. Then wool blankets or woven fabric. Then animal hides positioned fur side up, creating a sleeping surface where fur trapped air and prevented body heat from conducting into the platform below. The positioning of sleeping areas relative to the langled was carefully calculated. The family head and honored guests slept at the far end of the hall opposite the entrance, where they were farthest from cold infiltration and where smoke was most diluted. Children and lower-status family members slept closer to the entrance where conditions were harsher but still survivable. Small side rooms or alcoves branched off the main hall in some larger turf houses, creating spaces for storage, for food preparation, or for additional sleeping when the household was large. These rooms had no independent heating. They were warmed only by heat radiating through the turf walls from the main hall's langled. This meant they were colder than the main hall but still far warmer than the exterior. The sleeping system inside the turf house combined the platform insulation with bedding and clothing to create thermal protection adequate for survival. The bedding started with the furs and blankets on the platform itself. Over this, sleepers wore their day clothing, wool tunics, wool pants, wool socks. Vikings didn't undress for sleep because removing warm clothing and then trying to rewarm it with body heat was metabolically expensive and left people vulnerable during the transition. Additional coverings went over the sleeping people. Heavy wool blankets, animal furs, sheepskins, layered to create total covering thickness of 10 to 15 centimeters. The coverings were shared among family members sleeping side by side, creating collective warmth where each person's body heat contributed to the thermal environment experienced by everyone. The sleeping positions maximized shared warmth. People slept close together, bodies touching, eliminating air gaps where heat could escape. Children slept between adults to benefit from warmth radiating from both sides. The elderly, whose metabolism generated less heat, were positioned in the warmest locations closest to the langled and surrounded by high heat-producing adults. In the coldest weather, when exterior temperatures dropped toward -30 degrees Celsius and the langled fire was damped down overnight to conserve fuel, the interior might drop to 5 to 10 degrees Celsius. That's cold by modern heated home standards, but it's 35 to 40 degrees warmer than the lethal exterior, and it's survivable with the clothing and bedding systems Vikings used. The overnight management required vigilance. One adult remained partially alert through the night, monitoring the langled to ensure it maintained adequate flame without burning too hot or producing dangerous smoke. This watch duty rotated among capable household members so no single person became dangerously sleep-deprived over the long winter. The watcher would add fuel to the langled periodically, adjust the roof vent if smoke was accumulating or if too much heat was escaping, and check that all sleeping family members were adequately covered. They would verify that no one had shifted position to expose themselves to dangerous cold and that the youngest and oldest showed no signs of hypothermia. The food preparation and storage systems in the turf house took advantage of the temperature differentials within the structure. The main hall maintained 10 to 15 degrees Celsius when the Langold was burning actively. The side rooms and storage alcoves with no direct heating might be 0 to 5 degrees Celsius. The space near the entry passage could drop near freezing. This created natural refrigeration zones within the house. Fresh meat and fish that needed to stay frozen were stored near the entrance. Foods that needed cool but not frozen storage went in the side rooms. Items that required warmer conditions stayed in the main hall near the Langold. Dried and preserved foods, the foundation of the winter diet, were stored in the coolest areas to prevent any degradation from warmth while being protected from the extreme cold that could damage some preserved items. Stockfish, dried cod, dried mutton, preserved butter, aged cheese, dried seaweed, all the foods that had been prepared during summer and autumn were positioned strategically to maximize preservation through the winter months. The food consumed during winter had to provide extraordinary caloric density because the body's energy demand in cold conditions is enormous. An adult Viking working moderately and living in a turf house at 10 degrees Celsius might burn 3,500 to 4,500 calories per day just for basic metabolism and minimal activity. This energy came from a diet heavy in preserved meat, fish, and dairy fats. Dried fish could be eaten without cooking, preserving fuel. Preserved butter and cheese provided concentrated fats that delivered 9 calories per gram. Dried meat supplemented with whatever fresh meat was available from livestock kept through the winter provided protein and additional fats. The diet was monotonous by modern standards, but it was calibrated for cold weather survival. The high fat content provided the concentrated energy that allowed people to meet their caloric needs without consuming impossibly large volumes of food. The preserved nature of most items meant they could be stored through the entire winter without spoilage. Cooking happened on or near the Langold, using the heat that was already being generated for space heating rather than burning additional fuel solely for food preparation. A large iron pot suspended over the Langold could simmer constantly, cooking whatever combination of meat, fish, grains and vegetables was available into a stew that provided hot food throughout the day. The social organization inside the turf house during winter reflected both thermal realities and cultural values. The household head sat in the place of honor at the hall's far end, but this was also the warmest position farthest from the cold entrance. The hierarchical social structure aligned conveniently with the thermal gradient of the space. Women's work areas were positioned near the Langold where light from the fire and warmth made textile work possible through the dark winter months. Spinning wool, weaving fabric, sewing clothing, all the textile production that clothed the family, happened in the warmest, best-lit areas of the hall. Children's play areas were similarly positioned near the Langold where they could benefit from warmth and light while remaining under adult supervision. Keeping children safe and warm through a 6-month winter in confined quarters required constant attention and spatial organization that minimized conflict while maximizing warmth. The maintenance of the turf house through winter was continuous. Snow accumulating on the roof needed to be cleared periodically to prevent dangerous weight buildup, though the roof's massive construction could support substantial loads. Ice forming on the roof vent needed to be removed to prevent ventilation blockage that could lead to carbon monoxide accumulation. The turf walls themselves required periodic inspection. Heavy snow or rain could saturate sections of the wall, potentially creating cold spots or even structural weakening. Damaged areas needed to be repaired with fresh turf blocks before the damage spread. The living grass on the exterior needed to be maintained. Areas where grass had died left the underlying turf vulnerable to erosion. When spring finally arrived and temperatures rose above freezing, the turf house required substantial renewal work. The winter's damage was repaired with fresh turf. The interior was cleaned of the accumulation of 6 months of continuous occupation. Fresh grass or rushes were spread on the floors. Textiles and furs were aired and cleaned. The comparison between Viking turf houses and the stone castles and wooden halls that existed elsewhere in medieval Europe is instructive. Stone castles were prestigious and defensible, but they were thermal disasters. Stone walls conduct cold effectively, making interiors brutally cold despite massive fireplaces consuming enormous quantities of wood. The wealthy inhabitants of stone castles often suffered through winters that were less comfortable than what Vikings experienced in their turf houses. Wooden halls required vast quantities of timber that simply weren't available in Iceland or Greenland. Even where wood existed, Wooden structures without adequate insulation were cold and drafty. The gaps between planks allowed wind infiltration that no amount of fire could compensate for. The turf house, built from materials literally cut from the ground, outperformed both alternatives in thermal efficiency. The massive insulation prevented heat loss. The Earth's thermal mass buffered temperature swings. The living grass created a self-renewing weather barrier. The whole structure worked with the landscape rather than fighting against it. Modern analysis of preserved turf house ruins and reconstructed structures confirms what historical accounts suggested. Interior temperatures in a well-built turf house with a modest fire could be maintained 40 to 50 degrees Celsius warmer than exterior temperatures. Fuel consumption was a fraction of what stone or wooden structures required for comparable comfort. The thermal performance approached modern insulated buildings despite using only natural materials and medieval construction techniques. The turf house represents one of history's most successful adaptations to extreme cold using limited resources. Vikings didn't have modern insulation materials, but they understood that sufficient thickness of earth and grass could provide equivalent thermal protection. They didn't have modern HVAC systems, but they engineered ventilation that managed smoke while retaining heat. They didn't have modern building science, but through empirical observation and accumulated experience they developed construction methods that solved problems modern builders still struggle with. That's how Vikings built turf houses to survive -30 degrees Celsius Nordic winters. Through massive insulation using living turf blocks that continued growing after placement. Through careful site selection that used natural wind protection and earth-stable temperature. Through heating systems optimized for scarce fuel. Through ventilation that balanced smoke removal with heat retention. Through interior layouts that positioned people to benefit from available warmth. Through sleeping systems that multiplied body heat effectiveness. Through food storage that used the structure's temperature zones. Through maintenance that kept the living building functioning through centuries. The knowledge wasn't written in books or taught in schools. It was embedded in practice, transmitted from generation to generation through direct participation. Children grew up in turf houses, learning through observation and increasing responsibility until they could build and maintain their own structures. The knowledge was tested every winter when inadequate execution meant cold, hunger, or death. The turf house worked because it was complete. Every element addressed specific mechanisms by which cold killed people or made survival impossible. Remove the massive wall thickness and heat loss overwhelmed the limited fuel. Eliminate the entry airlock and cold infiltration undermined interior warmth. Fail to manage ventilation and smoke killed inhabitants. Neglect sleeping arrangements and people froze despite adequate shelter. Vikings survived and thrived in Iceland, Greenland, and the Faroe Islands for centuries using these grass-covered earth mounds. They built a society, raised families, created literature and art, developed complex social and economic systems, all while living through winters that would kill most modern people despite their technology. They did it through knowledge, through engineering that was accurate without equations, through buildings that worked because every element was refined through generations of experience where excellence was survival's only option.